thank you. And today, for Sakeliga's Policy Radar, we are being joined by Bheki Mahlobo from the Center for Risk Analysis. Now, Bheki is an analyst working for the CRA. And Bheki, you did quite some thorough work recently about the unemployment and the unemployment problem in South Africa. Now, previously, I've spoken to your colleague David Ansara about unemployment, but you did a deeper dive into the unemployment realities in South Africa, if I can call it like that. But Bheki, welcome, and please tell us a bit about yourself, just quickly, and then we can look at unemployment.
Hi Gerard, thank you so much for having me on. I'm an analyst at the Center for Risk Analysis. I work quite closely with Dr. Frans Kounia as well as David Ansara, who's our CEO. Frans Kounia is the director at the center, so I mainly deal with research, writing, as well as reporting to clients.
Yes, and thank you for joining us, Bheki. Now, Bheki, we often in South Africa, we hear the problem in terms of unemployment being called a structural unemployment problem. Could you please elaborate and explain to us why is it being called structural? I suppose there are different types of unemployment, but why specifically in South Africa are we often referring to structural?
So in the mainstream sense of things, structural unemployment is defined as individuals that do not have the adequate skills for employment. However, in the reports that I published, what I refer to as structural unemployment, I mean that it is the lacking of policy reforms coming within the ANC government that has led to a high level of unemployment rates in South Africa. It's not the inability of South Africans that essentially don't have the skills to work, they do. Essentially the regulations that come from government that inhibit those South Africans to work.
Yes, Bheki, now when we're thinking about unemployment, I suppose many things go into unemployment. Now you said the policy realities in South Africa, obviously that's one consideration, but other things like education, business formation, a lot of things, I suppose, go into unemployment.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. I mean, one of the data points that I look at in the report is looking at the relation between education as well as employment. And individuals that have a tertiary education have high employment levels compared to the ones that unfortunately don't have any form of schooling. They are less likely to find a job and able to provide for their families. So one of the issues here that we face in South Africa is the degrading levels of educational levels in South Africa that unfortunately leads to a lot of these South Africans being unable to properly equip themselves with the skills necessary to essentially take on employment.
Is Bheki, as a bit of and I know this is a bit of an outside question, if I can call it that, but is the solution to unemployment just getting government to employ more people?
No, that is absolutely not the solution to the unemployment crisis that South Africa faces. In fact, I believe that's actually a worrying trend that we're seeing right now. Due to the low growth levels that we're seeing in the country, we're seeing a massive amount of government employment. And unfortunately, that's a bad thing. That's essentially a worrying trend that I see. Essentially, for every expansion that the government spends on, which was emphasized last week by the midterm budget speech, that's every rand taken out of the private sector. And most jobs come from the private sector and productive activities come from the private sector. So the answer to high unemployment levels in South Africa is not more government employment. It's in fact more private employment that can be enabled through proper reform, proper structural reform.
Yes, Bheki, no, I totally agree. I mean, indeed, at Sakeliga, we're also concerned about the lack of reform and consideration of some policies, but we'll get to that a bit later in the discussion. I just want to, could you help us to give us a good perspective in terms of unemployment in South Africa? These numbers are very abstract, and we know we had figures like 31.1% of people being unemployed, dropping to, I don't know, now you have to help me, 23.1, I suppose, during the lockdown, everything. But how would we explain unemployment in a way that makes sense to the man on the street, as it were?
So if we were to define what essentially is unemployment, it's the inability for you to provide for your families. A lot of these people that unfortunately lost their jobs in the first and second quarter, mostly in this year, unfortunately have a high dependency ratio. They need to be able to provide to their families. And so what we saw coming from Q2 figures is that Stats SA reported that the official unemployment number dropped from around 30.1% to 23.3%, if not 1%. And so that the reason for the drop essentially was mainly because of the lockdown. Due to the lockdown, a lot of businesses were closed, and unfortunately, a lot of South Africans were unable to essentially seek for a job, look for a job and whatnot, and be able to be employed. And when you look at the definition of unemployment provided by Stats SA, you have to be willing and able to find a job. So what essentially happened in the second quarter is that the individuals that were unable to look for a job because of the lockdown were essentially added to the non-economically active population, which roughly rose to 5.2 million in the second quarter. That is a staggering figure. That's something that South Africa has never seen before since 1994 in democracy. And that's a particularly worrying trend. And that's why essentially, which we'll talk about later in this conversation, why we emphasized on the labor absorption rate, because that gave us a clear indication as to where the country is heading in terms of employment numbers.
Yeah. Now, Bheki, we are often in the news and in the media, we'll see comparisons with other countries. Now, I'm certain it's not as simple as just comparing countries with one another, but in terms of international comparisons, how does South Africa stack up?
Quite poorly, unfortunately. So one of the things that we also looked at is the labor absorption rate, which I mentioned earlier. In international standards, it's called the employment rate. And what it essentially is, it's taking the number of working age people, that's people between the ages of 15 and 64, that are employed. In other words, it's looking at the number of people employed in the country. And in South Africa, that figure dropped substantially. It went from around 42.4% in the first quarter to 36.3% in the second quarter. That is a staggering figure when you compare it to other emerging countries. Roughly the middle income economies or societies is roughly 60%. And when you compare that to developed nations employment levels are roughly 70%, which in the first quarter is 80% in certain countries. And so that subsequently dropped because of global lockdowns that we saw coming from around in these countries during the year. But it didn't drop to the same amount that South Africa dropped. And that's mainly due to the stringent regulation and the counterproductive lockdown that we had, as well as on top of that, we've had very strict labor laws in South Africa.
Okay, Bheki, so now looking at, I suppose, the bigger picture on labor policy and labor laws and everything in South Africa, what is the role of labor policy and the way labor is being regulated in South Africa in terms of unemployment? Do you see a link? Do you see problems? Well, what's the take?
So the major issue that I see coming from in terms of labor policy is the minimum wage, which essentially outlaws low income jobs. And that is a worrying regulation, because essentially means that you are essentially pricing out the ability of the South African to upskill themselves. The fallacy that comes from government is that they assume that these people that work below minimum wage, which is the price in which they set, will forever in their lives stay in that income level. And that's not true. That income that essentially they receive is a step towards a higher income. And the low income that they get enables them to provide for their families. And unfortunately, what is unseen, something that I like to look at as an analyst, I like to look at individuals that are not seen. When you essentially impose minimum wages, is that you're pricing out future unemployment. And it's those individuals that are not particularly seen. And that's why we essentially call the report locked out, because we're trying to figure out, we're trying to identify the South Africans that have been essentially left out of policy within the ANC.
Yes, Bheki, that's a very interesting point. Looking at the unseen effects of policies, I think that's what any responsible public and policy analyst should be doing. So who are we missing in terms of labor regulations and the way labor is being regulated in South Africa?
So we're mainly missing the youth. A staggering amount of youth is mainly impacted. The negative consequences of unemployment are largely felt by the young age population between the ages of 15 and 25. These are the people that are mostly unemployed within the country. And unfortunately, that has grave consequences. We might actually see an increase in protest action as well as violence within the country, essentially political instability. So the major burden of unemployment is largely felt by the young population. And if you would look across racial groups, it is unfortunately the Black population that is largely hit by unemployment. We saw during the country, during Q2, that unemployment largely impacted everyone, but to a large extent, it largely impacted the Black population.
Yes. Bheki, now in terms of other consequences of the structural unemployment crisis, as you call it, in the report for South Africa, what are some of the other things that you are concerned about?
So particularly the worrying trend, which I touched upon earlier, is that when you have an economy which is very low, there's low economic growth, you have an increase in the size of government. And with the increase in government, in the size of government, that essentially extracts resources from the private sector. And that leads to lower investment levels in those particular industries, which inevitably lead to a lower economic growth. So the worrying trend that I see right now facing South Africa is an ever-increasing state. A line that I like to look at is essentially government expenditures as a proportion of GDP, which was updated last week by the midterm budget speech. And if you look at the consolidated accounts of government, government expenditures projected to be roughly 40% as a proportion of GDP. That's close to 50% of GDP. That is a staggering figure and will have dire consequences for South Africa.
Yeah, obviously it's not sustainable at those levels, especially if you take in the tax levels that are also declining or that have declined. But Bheki, in terms of the Center for Risk Analysis ideas on policy reform for unemployment and to assist solving this unemployment crisis, what are you guys looking at?
So one of the first steps would be to remove minimum wages. That will be the first step that will enable uneducated South Africans, in other words, South Africans that were unable to go to universities, to seek low wage employment. A second policy that we'd like to look at is looking at empowerment policies. We believe that empowerment policies coming within the government have largely been ineffective to essentially empower South Africans. We believe that a proper way of looking at empowerment policies would be to empower the poor individual. Rather than looking at the skin color of individual, you look at whether they are poor or not. And we believe that that will largely impact the poorest of the poor, benefit the poorest of the poor. So those are largely policies that we're looking at, as well as improving the educational system in South Africa. As you give South Africans the ability to upskill themselves, that leads to higher employment opportunities in the future. So those are one of the few policies that we look at in order to solve this high unemployment crisis in South Africa.
All right, Bheki, any final thoughts that you would like to share with us about the unemployment or just in general?
So in order to solve the high unemployment crisis in South Africa that we currently are facing, I believe what needs to happen is that the ANC government needs to impose structural reform. That means that there needs to be accountability within government in the sense that high government officials that were found to be corrupt in terms of procurement tenders and whatnot needs to go to jail. That's unfortunately something we haven't seen coming within the ANC, even though we've seen some talk of it, of low-level ANC members. I believe a key indicator as to whether the South African government is willing to reform is whether it takes those individuals that were corrupt to jail. Another policy that we look at is looking at mostly increasing private sector involvement. That is, in a way, removing stringent labor policies that prevent businesses from essentially hiring people, as well as even firing people. That will make it easier for businesses to hire low-skilled individuals. So that's my key takeaway, is that if we want to look at the indication as whether the ANC government is willing to reform, A key indicator that I'd like to look at is SOEs. Are they receiving further bailouts or not? And unfortunately, they are receiving further funds now through other government departments. And unfortunately, that's a negative trend that I see in South Africa.
Okay, Bheki, thank you for the work you guys are doing, tracking all the policies and all the, I suppose the challenges, but also all the opportunities in South Africa. And yes, we look forward to talk to you soon. Thank you, Bheki.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me on.